The Peter Schiff Show.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Indeed. Indeed knows hiring needs to be cost-effective when you're running your own business. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Peter. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, earlier today, we got the government's measure, the official measure of inflation. The CPI for the month of July was released. You know, it's kind of like if your kids were allowed to grade their own report cards, and then they brought them home to show you what a good job they were doing at school. You know, the government should not be calculating inflation when the government, A, creates the inflation, but B, has a vested interest in underreporting that inflation to the public. So you always take the CPI with a grain of salt. In fact, if you want to get a more accurate measure, just as a rule of thumb, double whatever number the government reports. And that's probably a lot closer to the actual number than the number that is released. But before I talk about the CPI that came out today, I want to talk about the PPI that came out yesterday, because that number was actually a little bit better than the markets had expected. Excuse me, I just realized I didn't have my mic. Let me put that on, get better audio. Don't know why nobody didn't notice that beforehand. In any event, the PPI that came out yesterday, which was actually better than expected, and maybe that raised some hopes that the CPI that came out today would have also been better than expected. So the expectation for producer prices was for an increase of 0.2, which actually would have been the same as the prior month. And instead, prices rose by 0.1, so slightly better. The year-over-year number was supposed to be 2.6, which would have matched the 2.6 from the prior month, which they did revise up to 2.7. It came out at up 2.2, so quite a bit below what the markets had been anticipating. The core number, excluding food and energy, was supposed to rise by 0.2, and it was flat, didn't rise at all. And they actually revised the 0.4% increase from June to 0.3. So a revision that actually went in the right direction. So this was a better than expected report. Year over year, the core, which was supposed to be 3%, which would have matched June, it came all the way down to 2.4. So way below expectations. The only number that was worse than expected was if you also took out trade services. And that resulted in a 0.3% increase rather than a 0.1, and year over year was up 3.3. Now, the trade services actually includes a lot of the markups that retail companies would charge. And so the fact that this number went up less than expected may indicate there's some pressure on margins going forward, in that companies are eating a larger percentage of their increased costs. And so that doesn't bode well for earnings if that's the case. You know, people like Elizabeth Warren are always accusing greedy companies of gouging the customers with price hikes. But more often than not, most companies do everything they can to insulate their customers. They raising prices is almost a last resort, because businesses are afraid that higher prices will result in less sales, that their customers may take their business elsewhere. Remember, in competition, businesses are always trying to lower prices because they know that's how you get more business. That's how you take share away from your competitors. The lower the price, the more you can sell. And the more you can sell, the more you can make. So if I'm really greedy and I own a business, my greed will lead me to try to lower my prices, because by lowering my prices, I'll make more money for myself. See, the problem is people like Elizabeth Warren don't understand how capitalism works, right? Maybe because they've never actually participated in it. They've worked in government their entire life, but that's a bit of a tangent. I'm going to kind of get myself back on track here to talk about these inflation numbers. So yesterday's number was better than expected. And, the gold stocks rallied, although gold didn't really go up that much on this number, but the dollar got hit. In fact, the dollar hit I think a 5-month low yesterday, and then it went even lower today before the dollar paired some of its losses against, after the CPI came out, although most of those losses were against the euro. The dollar was a bit stronger against some of the other currencies, but the euro is a big part of the dollar index, which is why it was down on the day. But let me get to the CPI number. And if you get your news from, the mainstream media, you would think that this was great news. I mean, I was on Newsmax earlier today. Actually, just before, it was at 8 o'clock that I did. I don't know if it was live or taped, but they played a clip for me to comment on. And it was a mainstream network. I forget which one it was, but they were reporting on the great news that we supposedly got today from the government about inflation. And so the number was supposed to be 3%. That was the consensus for the year-over-year number. The month-over-month number was supposed to come out at 0.2, and it came out exactly at 0.2. So it wasn't worse than expected, but it wasn't better than expected. And everybody, of course, is looking at these data points on inflation because Jerome Powell at the last press conference basically said, well, I'm data dependent. And the inflation data is probably the most significant data that supposedly he's depending on. And the markets right now, based on what happened Monday with, following the bad jobs report on Friday, and then the market collapse on Monday, ever since then, the markets are now pricing in a 100% chance, basically, of a rate cut in September. And the only thing that potentially could derail that expectation would be bad news on inflation. And according to the markets, we didn't get that. And according to the media, we got great news on inflation, even though it's pretty much exactly what had been expected. But where the number was slightly lower, and this is what the media, is jumping on, was the year-over-year number. Year-over-year, we were up 2.9%, right? So we got a 2 handle, right? No longer a 3 handle, 2.9. I'm not sure exactly where it is because they round these numbers. So it was probably 2.9 something, right? It wasn't even 2.9 even, right? So it was somewhere between 2.9 and 3. And they rounded it down to 2.9. So it's a meaningless improvement over expectations, but it's went in the other direction from the prior month. The June CPI was down 0.1%. So now July is up 0.2. That's going in the wrong direction, right? Why is this inflation report the good news that the Fed's been holding out for to cut rates in September? Because if the Fed really was data dependent, there's nothing about this July inflation report that would lead the Fed to say, aha, now we can cut. We didn't know if we can cut in June, but now we're sure in July, when the July number is actually worse than the June number, except for the year-over-year number. But even the up 0.2%, even that number, annualize that out, that's 2.5% inflation. That's still a long way from 2. Remember, when inflation was 1.5%, right, 0.5% below 2, oh my God, the Fed was like, we need QE. This is horrible. We can't allow this. We're way below target. So if 1.5% is so far below target that we need 0% interest rates and quantitative easing, why would 2.5% be a signal that, oh, we can start cutting interest rates because, we're close enough to 2% that we could start cutting. But also, if you think about the headline number at 2.9, the headline number, which had gotten above 9% at the peak, it first went down to 3% in June of 2023. So 13 months ago, the CPI was at 3%. Now it's at 2.9, 13 months later. So what? It took us 13 months to shave 0.1% off the CPI and probably less because of the rounding. At this pace, if the CPI goes down 0.1% every 13 months, it'll take almost 10 years to get down to 2%. Why should the Fed be cutting rates? If anything, the Fed should be looking at these numbers and say, you know what? Rates are too low. We stopped too soon. We need higher interest rates because it's taking us too long to get down to 2%. Remember, these are still price increases. Americans were upset a year ago that prices were too high, that things were unaffordable. Well, if they were unaffordable a year ago, they're even more unaffordable now because the prices have gone up, not down. And again, you got to double these numbers. So if the government is saying 3, you're paying 6. But, one of the biggest frauds, if you just look at the numbers that the government reports, right? They give you these numbers. Almost every category year over year was up way more than 2.9%. So if almost every category was up more than 2.9, how was the whole thing up 2.9? And that's because you had one category that went way down that is actually a pretty big weighting, and that is used car prices, which came down 11% year over year. And so that really helped pull down the inflation number to get it below 3%. Without that, it would have been above 3%. And the media couldn't have been talking about how great it is that inflation is now below 3%. But how many used cars does your typical American buy every month? None, right? If you buy a used car, maybe you do it every 4 or 5 years, if that. Maybe you buy one in 8 to 10 years. I'm not sure how long the typical American keeps a car, but I bet right now it's going to be for a long time because people can't afford to buy new cars or a new used car. Even if the price has gone down, the financing costs are quite a bit higher than they were. But it's really irrelevant what a used car costs you if you didn't buy one. Now, of course, a lot of Americans, they sell their cars, right? So used car prices going down only helps the guy who buys the used car. It doesn't help the guy who has to sell the used car, right? Because people may have to sell their cars. And the fact that the prices have gone down, that's actually bad news for a lot of people. But it's really irrelevant to the CPI. What's far more relevant is auto insurance, right? Because every motorist, whether they buy a new car or a used car or just keep on driving the car they've got, they're paying their auto insurance every month. And insurance was up 16.5% year over year. So that's a big increase. Now, that was a much smaller weighting in the CPI, but that shows you how meaningless it is. It doesn't matter that the used car you didn't buy is cheaper. What matters is the auto insurance policy that you have to pay. That got more expensive. So that is the real story behind these fake inflation numbers. And that is why President Biden is so unpopular, because people blame the higher cost of living on him. Now, for some reason, a lot of people aren't blaming Kamala Harris, because I guess she had nothing to do with it, because she was, vice president, and she basically did nothing while the president was screwing up the economy. And somehow she's running on a policy of change, right? Even though she's there in the administration. But I'll get to that a little bit later in the podcast. I want to stay on the economic topic. But another statistic that came, I think it was yesterday or the day before, but we got the the numbers for the July deficit. And this is a lot more important as an indicator of inflation than the official reports that measure prices. Because where is the source of inflation? Why do we have inflation? We have inflation because the government has to create money. The Federal Reserve expands the money supply. Why does it do that? Well, it does that to finance deficit spending. The government doesn't collect enough in taxes, and so the difference has to be created out of thin air. So looking at the deficits is a much better indicator of where inflation is headed than looking at the government numbers. And so in July, the U.S. government just reported its biggest July or second biggest July deficit in history. The only July where the government ran a larger deficit than this July was July 2021. And that was, of course, the COVID stimulus. The economy was still in lockdown. And we had all this new stimulus money that was entering the economy at that time. And so the government was running these enormous deficits. But if you take that July 2021 out, that had all that stimulus spending, this would have been the worst July. And in fact, what's even more problematic for this July than that July is that 25% of all the taxes that the government collected went to pay interest on the national debt. I mean, think about that. Think about the significance of that number. Imagine if 25% of what you earned went to pay interest on what you've borrowed. And not your home mortgage, because at least there you've borrowed money to acquire an asset. This is having interest to pay off debt that you just spent, money that you just, you bought clothes with it, you bought food with it, you bought gasoline with it, you took a vacation. You don't have an asset that you could sell to pay down the debt. It's like having 25% of your income going to the interest on your credit cards, right? Not the principal payments on your credit cards, just the interest, right? The principal would be intact. So this is a very precarious situation that the government is in. But the problem is it's going to get even worse because every month the interest bill is going to get higher and higher and higher as more debt matures. Low-yielding debt matures and has to be rolled over at higher rates. That adds to the amount of interest that we're paying on the debt, as does all the new debt that we're piling on now, the $2-3 trillion a year or more, that also has to be financed at today's much higher interest rates. Anyway, we got a quick commercial break, so stick around. We'll be right back.
We're driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messages so you can contact with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agreed. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join the 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. What I love most about Indeed is how simple it makes the hiring process and allows you to do all your hiring in one place. Candidates you invite to apply are 3 times more likely to actually apply for your job than the candidates who see it in search alone, according to U.S. Indeed data. Indeed gets you one step closer to the hire by immediately matching you with quality candidates. And now listeners of my show can get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/Peter. Just go to Indeed.com/Peter right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/Peter. Terms and conditions apply. If you need to hire, then you need Indeed.
All right, so the enormous budget deficits are a leading indicator of future inflation. And that's why it's so ridiculous when Powell says that these deficits are irrelevant, that the Fed doesn't even consider them in its policy decisions, when it should be one of the most important things that it considers, because the Fed is being asked to monetize these debts. Now, what the Fed should do is refuse to do it and put some real pressure on the government, truly be an independent central bank. You know, Donald Trump, generated a lot of, I guess, hype when he did his press conference, and he was asked about whether or not he should have a say in monetary policy and interest rates. And he said, yes, he should have a say. He said, I'm a businessman, I'm successful, I've made a lot of money. And so my input is probably valuable. I probably know a lot more about the economy than, people on the Fed, which may be a true statement because they don't necessarily know any more than anybody else. But the reason that he should not have said that was because the Fed is supposed to be independent of politics, whereas a president may be more concerned about how the economy looks because he wants to be popular, he wants to get reelected. The central bank is supposed to be above the fray. They're not supposed to care how the economy looks. They're not supposed to be worried about having to win a popularity contest because they don't have to be elected. And so when Trump says, yes, I should have a say, that kind of compromises that independence, which is phony anyway, because, beneath the surface, the Fed is extremely independent. They don't do anything that might impose any short-term pain. So the whole thing is a farce, but Donald Trump shouldn't even, be saying that because the media is still pretending that there is independence. And now he's threatening to get rid of that or interfere with that, which would be perceived as a negative thing, because all of the interference is always going to be for lower interest rates and more money printing. In fact, the only thing that Trump ever advocated for when he was president was for lower rates. He wanted negative rates. He was mad at Powell because Powell raised rates. Now, as a candidate, he was mad at him for the opposite, but it all switched the minute he was in office, and he wanted Powell to help the economy look better during his first term so that he could win a second. Now, of course, if Trump does get elected again, he can't serve a third term, so you may not have that. But Trump doesn't want anything bad to happen on his watch, because anything that happens on his watch, he's going to either get credit or blame. So he'd rather have good things happen when he's in office and really bad things happen that may be a consequence of that when he's out of office. I mean, that's exactly the case with the inflation and a lot of the problems that we're suffering now under Biden. A lot of the money that is now being used to bid up consumer prices was printed when Trump was president to monetize Trump's deficits. But the fact that the official inflation rates didn't rise on his watch allows him to say, hey, everything was great when I was president and it's lousy now. So I know that Trump is not going to want bad things to happen, even if they're a down payment on good things, right? He doesn't want the bitter tasting medicine swallowed while he's president if it's not going to really bear fruit until he's out of office, when some other president gets to take credit for it. But, really, I'd like to have a president who doesn't care about who gets the credit. It's just somebody who has the willingness and the courage to do the right thing, like the type of courage that Trump displayed when he was shot at. I'd like to see him have that kind of courage to veto government spending and cut government spending. And I'm gonna get into that in a bit. I just want to finish this topic on inflation. So based on the news that we've got today, based on the CPI, based on the news on the deficits, if the Fed really were data dependent, like Powell claims, there is nothing in this data that would support a rate cut in September. Absolutely nothing. In fact, the data actually suggests the opposite, that the Fed is not tight enough and that rates need to go up because the debts are going up. And the whole purpose of the rate hikes is to slow down borrowing. What the Fed is supposed to be trying to accomplish here is to reduce spending and increase savings. That's what brings down inflation. Because if you reduce spending, then there's less demand for goods. A lot of that spending is a function of borrowing. Consumers borrow money and spend it. Well, if they're still borrowing money and spending it, it means rates are still too low. Rates need to be so high that consumers don't borrow money. They just stop buying stuff because they can't afford to borrow. That's what you need. And if rates go high enough, people might actually save to earn those real interest rates, and that will result in more production. So you get more stuff and you get less spending, and so you get prices coming down or prices going up a lot more slowly. But the fact that the Fed's rate hikes have had no effect on borrowing continues. Maybe not as many people are taking out mortgages to buy houses, but they haven't cut back on their consumption because household debt, not looking at mortgage debt, but household debt's at an all-time record high. Credit card debt is an all-time record high. Government debt. The government is supposed to respond to rate hikes by borrowing less, by cutting government spending. None of that has happened because rates never got high enough to force that to happen. And now the Fed is about to cut rates. I still believe that despite this data, we're going to get a rate cut in September. And the main reason we're going to get a rate cut in September is because now the markets are counting on a rate cut in September. That's why we rallied back from the sell-off on Monday. And so now that the market is pricing in a September rate cut, there's no way that Powell is not going to deliver. Because one of the things that Powell has done is he always meets market expectations. So if the market doesn't expect a rate cut, well, then he's under no pressure to deliver one. But what he doesn't want to do is pull the rug out from under the markets. If the markets are anticipating a rate cut and they've priced that in, and then at the last moment, you do the rug pull and you tell the markets, no, the markets are going to crash. We got a small taste of that on that Monday. And so I don't think there's any way that Powell is going to deny the markets what the markets now expect. But it's not just that the markets expect it, but the government needs it because of the interest burden on the debt. Powell can look at the numbers and see 25% of every tax dollar is going to interest. How can he slow that down? By lowering rates, because then as bonds mature, they could be rolled over at a lower rate. But, I think when the Fed finally gets around to cutting rates, it's going to backfire because I think long-term rates are going to go up, not down. Maybe not that day, but maybe. But I think they're going to go up. I think the yield curve is going to normalize and steepen because the markets are going to realize that these rate cuts are inflationary. And it's not just going to be rate cuts. That's not going to be enough. It's going to be followed up with a return to quantitative easing. Mark my words, I don't think the balance sheet is ever going to get below 7 trillion because before it gets to that number, the Fed is going to reverse and go back to QE. And they may even have to do it before the elections, depending on the popularity of Kamala Harris. One more point I want to make before I start talking more politics here is I noticed that a solar company, SunPower, about a week ago. So I didn't mention it on my last podcast, but I noticed it, after I did that podcast. But last week, SunPower filed for bankruptcy. Company's been in business for 39 years, and they install solar panels on people's roofs, which is what, of course, the Biden administration wants. They want more people using solar power, right? It's part of the whole green new scam, whatever it is. But global warming, we've all got to move away from fossil fuels, and so the Biden administration wants everybody to use solar power, even though it may be less economical than using fossil fuels. And so one of the things the government does is they subsidize. They've had subsidies. You get tax write-offs if you buy a solar. I bought a solar powered yacht. I get a big tax write-off because of the solar. Right now, that's not why I did it, but it's hey, I get a tax credit because I did that. But one of the other things that Biden did is that he imposed big tariffs on imported solar panels. And so what did that do? That increased the cost of these solar panels, making the decision to buy them, right, tilting it to the degree that a lot of Americans decided they didn't want it anymore because it didn't pencil out. Because people are looking at the cost versus benefit. How much does it cost me to put in these solar panels? And then what do I save in my electric bill? And so the cost, the upfront cost of buying, right, that's a big thing. And the question is, well, how long is the payback period? How many years will it take me in lower electricity bills to recover what I spent on these solar panels? Well, by jacking up the price of solar panels with these tariffs, it made it so a lot more Americans decided that it's not worth it. And so the company's sales collapsed. Now, it's not just the tariffs that did it. Also, interest rates went up. So, because a lot of people would borrow the money to pay for the solar. And of course, now you have to borrow at a higher rate, but you even need to borrow more money because the solar panels now cost a lot more, thanks in large part to these tariffs. So now you have to pay a higher interest on an even larger loan, right, to buy these more expensive panels. And so because demand collapsed, the company now goes out of business. And so what did Biden accomplish with these tariffs? I mean, I guess the goal was, well, we want to have this green revolution. We want everybody buying solar panels, but we want them buying solar panels that are made in America. Well, the problem is those are too expensive. So if you really want people to go to solar power, you have to have the solar panels as cheap as possible so people can actually afford to make the switch. But just like all government policies, it completely backfired. And so now fewer people are going to have solar because of these tariffs. And again, it shows you who pays the tariffs. It's not the foreigners, it's the Americans. Right? And Trump makes the same mistake when talks about, oh, the Chinese are paying these high tariffs. No, they're not. The Chinese don't pay any of the tariffs. Americans pay the tariffs if they buy Chinese products, or if they don't buy Chinese products, if they buy a Vietnamese product, for example, because there is no tariff, but the price of that product is much higher than what the cost of the Chinese product was before the tariff, but it's cheaper than what it is now with the tariff. Well, then the American pays for the tariff by buying a more expensive product. And of course, that's the worst thing for the government because the government doesn't get any tax revenue, right? At least if an American buys the Chinese product and pays the tariff, the government collects the money. But if instead the American just buys a less expensive product from Vietnam, the government collects nothing, right? So the U.S. government doesn't win anything, but the American consumer loses. But this was a double loss on SunPower because the company is now bankrupt, right? Because of these tariffs. And so, hey, I want to protect one company. The government said, hey, let's protect the solar power manufacturers from competition by having these tariffs. And so they protect that industry, but now they destroy this business that was selling solar panels to the public because now they're too expensive. See, what we really need is not protectionism. we need more innovation here in the United States. And how do we get that? We need fewer regulations, which is something that Trump is right about, and we need lower taxes. But we can't get that unless we cut government spending, which nobody really wants to talk about until we got Elon Trump with spaces. And I want to talk about that. And if you haven't listened, if you're one of the few people that didn't listen to Monday's live event, or I know it's been rebroadcast, but Elon Musk had a spaces with former President Donald Trump. And the two of them spoke for about 2 hours on spaces. Now they didn't take questions, right? So the rest of us were just able to listen. We weren't, participating in the conversation. Of course, there were too many people to even do that, right? I mean, I had a hard time with, a couple of thousand people on my spaces. I mean, he's got millions on his. In fact, initially, I think it was crashing the whole, system because it started about 45 minutes late. A lot of people, myself included, were having a hard time, just joining the spaces because it was just overwhelmed. I think Elon tweeted out that there was a denial of service attack where people were trying to prevent it. In fact, the European Union actually threatened Elon Musk if he allowed, Donald Trump to just speak freely on X, like a free conversation is somehow violating the EU's rules. I mean, how could words, right? And I talked about this on the last podcast, but words don't harm people. Words inform people. And even if the words are wrong, as far as if somebody is expressing an idea that's wrong, well, that's an opportunity for somebody else to express the opposite point of view or to point out why that person is wrong. But the fact that they're threatening Elon Musk for having a free conversation with somebody, and in fact, I understand that I think he's already they're trying to sue him. I think the UAW is trying to bring charges against him because of some comments he made that were anti-union. Well, why can't you be anti-union? I mean, if you could be pro-union, you should be able to be anti-union. I mean, one of the things he talked about was firing people for striking. And you can't talk about firing people who strike. Well, why not? I mean, I know there's a law that shouldn't be on the books that you're technically not allowed to fire somebody because they strike, but you should absolutely have that right. I mean, if you're allowed to strike, then as an employer, I should be allowed to fire you if you strike. I mean, fair is fair, right? I mean, if your job is so lousy, if you're being so underpaid, I should have a hard time replacing you, right? If you want to go on strike and I can easily find somebody else to take your job, what does that tell you? That tells you that you got a pretty good deal, right? So the fact that unions want to go on strike and then hold their employers hostage to say, hey, we're on strike and your business has to shut down unless you accede to our demands, that's extortion, right? When you tell an employer that they can't fire you, that's extortion. That's not collective bargaining. I've got no problem if employees want to get together and bargain for their wages and benefits collectively instead of individually. But the problem with that whole collective bargaining concept is not everybody is equal, right? Some people are harder workers, right? They work harder, they're more conscientious, they work better. How are they supposed to bargain with somebody who's a deadbeat, right? Who comes to work late, leaves early, does a lousy job? How do all those people bargain collectively? See, the people who want collective bargaining are those guys, are the guys that don't really work that hard, and they know that the deal that they're going to get collectively is better than the deal that they would get individually. But in order to do that, you've got other people who would be much better off cutting their own deal because they're working harder. So I don't really like the whole concept, but for certain types of jobs, maybe there's something there. But if workers want to unite and bargain collectively, that's their right. But if the employer wants to fire people who decide to go on strike, that's his right or her right, right? I mean, an employer wants to disrupt my business, wants to, say, hey, you can't run your business and we're going to prevent you from hiring people to replace us, or I guess you could replace them, but how do you hire somebody when you say, look, this is a temporary job because as soon as these guys are off strike, I got to fire you? And of course, the unions try to intimidate the people who try to take these jobs as scabs, and they try to, there's violence for people. Meanwhile, you got to operate a business. You can't just bring everything to a halt because your employees are trying to extort you. But meanwhile, so now the UAW that just endorsed, right, Kamala Harris wants to bring charges or something against Musk simply for expressing an opinion that about unions. The UAW, right? They helped destroy the American automobile industry. Elon Musk is trying to rebuild it, right? They kill jobs in the auto sector. He's creating jobs. I mean, go back to the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and see how many automobile companies we had in this country. Dozens of them. They're all gone. The only two that the UAW didn't destroy were Ford and General Motors. There was only two auto companies left in America, thanks to the UAW. And we had a tiny share of the global market. Now Elon Musk comes along and we got Tesla, right? He's created a new automobile company. What has the UAW done? Nothing, right? Yet, they want to bring an action against him for doing what? For speaking, for expressing an opinion? He didn't even do anything to the unions or the workers. He just expressed an opinion. Same thing as Donald Trump, right? But no. You can't say anything that is controversial, that offends somebody, because that we're no longer tolerant of any opinions that differ from our own. But I wanted to talk about the substance of that conversation. And I really like just about everything that Elon Musk had to say, especially about inflation. He accurately defined inflation as the growth of the money supply. The source is deficit spending. He went over exactly what creates inflation. And of course, Donald Trump is listening and agreeing with everything that Elon Musk is saying. Now, of course, if he was really going to be honest, he would have to come out and say, yeah, I'm partially responsible for this inflation, right? Because we ran big deficits when I was president. But of course, that's not what he's going to say. That's not the best way to win this election, but maybe it's sinking in. I mean, obviously, there's a friendship that's being formed between these two individuals. Obviously, if Donald Trump becomes the next president, he's not going to lose, or Elon Musk is not going to lose Trump's ear. So maybe Elon Musk will have an influence on Trump if he happens to have another term about cutting government spending. I mean, the only thing he wants to talk about cutting really was the Department of Education, but he wants to, when I hear him talk about it, he wants to take the money the government's spending on education and give it to the states. Well, it doesn't have any money to give because we're borrowing that money. So the whole idea is let's eliminate the Department of Education and we can apply the savings to reducing the debt, right? There's nothing to share with the states because we don't have the money in the first place. But we can't start with the Department of Education. Of course, the Department of Education is a waste of money. It doesn't educate anybody, right? Just like the Department of Energy is a waste. It doesn't produce any energy. In fact, we didn't even have the Department of Energy until Jimmy Carter, so we don't need it. Get rid of it, as well as a lot of other departments, including the Space Force, right? I mean, Trump doesn't want to acknowledge that. But one of the things we got to get rid of is the Space Force. In addition to correctly identifying the source of inflation and what inflation is, Elon Musk also had a lot of great things to say about Milei in Argentina, and Trump was agreeing. And what he's doing is slashing government spending. He is eliminating agencies and departments that they don't need. And that's exactly what Trump needs to do, including the Space Force, because he created a new department when what we needed was to eliminate existing departments. We did not need a Space Force. We could not afford a Space Force. And we certainly can't afford it now because we are even more broke than we were when it was established. But it's hard for Trump to talk about eliminating government departments or agencies when he created one. He did the opposite of what we needed. But Elon Musk knows what we need to do. Now, one thing I think that Musk said that I would, disagree with a bit. He talked about, hey, we got to look at all this government spending and look for the inefficiencies, look for the waste. We need to evaluate all the money that's being spent and whether it's doing any good. And, so we need somebody doing this because we need to get more efficient. Well, that's the problem with government. It's never going to be efficient, right? Government's not going to do anything efficiently by definition. What is it that drives efficiency? It's when you're spending your own money. Then you have an incentive to be efficient, right? Because you pay the cost directly if you're inefficient. But also, in a free market, I need to be efficient because I have competition. And if I'm not efficient and my competition is, well, my competition is going to outcompete me. They're going to win business at my expense because they're going to underprice me. So in order to get efficiency, you need the free market incentives that result in efficiency. Without those incentives, you don't get it. I mean, you can just see that in your house. I see it. I'm like the only guy in my house that turns off any lights, right? Like I earn the money. So when I see lights on in rooms where nobody is, I want to go and I turn the light off, right? Because I don't spend it. But I know, like, I have a condo here in Puerto Rico where all my water, I pay the same amount for my water bill regardless of how much water I use. It's metered for the whole complex. So I know there, I'm not as incentivized. I'll use water more wastefully because it doesn't affect my bill directly. I mean, indirectly it could, but directly it really doesn't, the way it does at my house, where I pay the water bill for all the water that I use. But anybody can see how these small incentives on costs, cause people to react differently. Like you go into a restaurant that's all you can eat. How much do you buy? I was on the cruise ship, when I was on that cruise. And when you go and you're at your dinner and I order 3 entrees and don't finish any one of them. Hey, I'll order whatever looks good because it doesn't matter. You're going to pay the same price. You don't have to decide between the lobster and the prime rib. Just order both. Now, you wouldn't do that in a normal restaurant where you're paying the bill. But if it's all you can eat and they'll bring you whatever you want. So the incentives are very different. So you're not going to get efficiency out of government. I mean, it's just not possible. That's why you need to keep government as small as possible because whatever they do, they're not going to be efficient at it. So you just got to eliminate it, right? And just leave the government with the fewest possible tasks and know that whatever they do is going to be inefficient. But that's just the way government works, right? Some things government's going to do, and they're going to do it inefficiently. In fact, if you look at the incentives that government has as opposed to the private sector, they almost have an incentive to be inefficient because the way the budgeting works, the more they spend one year, the more they get the next year. In fact, towards the end of a fiscal year, all these agencies are rushing to spend their money. They want to make sure they spend everything they've got so they can get more, right? And they also want to, get bigger and grow, right? If you're in charge of an agency or a department, you want to be in charge of a bigger agency, right? With more people. And so the incentive is to grow. That's why if you put the government in charge of solving a problem, the government's incentive is to make the problem that you've asked them to solve even bigger. Because now they can say, well, this problem's got worse. Well, we need more resources now. Because the government never admits its mistakes, right? So they don't create a department to solve a problem and then recognize that the department just made the problem they're trying to solve worse. They never do that, right? They never eliminate a department or an agency. They just fund it with more money. So they start an agency to solve a problem. And if that problem gets worse, they conclude, well, we just need more money. The agency needs to get bigger because now we have an even bigger problem to solve. So the agency itself has a incentive to perpetuate and make worse the problems that they're trying to solve, right? Even if they wanted to solve them, right? The incentives are to do the opposite. So that's what happens. So you're never going to have efficiency. That's why, I joke the war on poverty, right? Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty, and poverty won, right? Poverty went up. It didn't go down because all of the well-intentioned laws that they passed backfired, and the result was more poverty. But that was great for the poverty pimps in Washington, because the more poverty there is, well, the more government workers they now get into their agency. Oh, look how much worse the problem is. We really need to have more people fighting this war on poverty, because poverty is so much bigger now. So it's a bigger war. We need more troops, right? If they eliminated poverty, there'd be no reason to have all these agencies and departments. That's the last thing they want. But on the other hand, you have private charity. Yeah, they'd have to be happy to eradicate poverty, right? That's their goal, right? Their goal is to help people. The government's role is to entrap people. Private charities want to lift people out of poverty. Government wants to keep them trapped in poverty, because not only do they perpetuate the need for the agency, but now the people who are trapped in poverty need them. You create the dependency, and now you've got a voter for life, right? You make somebody dependent on a government check. What are they going to vote for? That check, right? They're single issue voters now. So the more you can create people who are dependent on government, the more you can count on their votes, because they're going to vote for you, and they're going to vote against anybody who threatens to take away what they have. I mean, that's why even Republicans who are willing to vote against new benefits, new programs before they're enacted, right? When they are enacted, they never vote to repeal them, because it's one thing not to give somebody something that they don't have, but it's a whole other thing to try to take away something from somebody that they do have. I was looking on X today, and I noticed Elizabeth Warren posted, and I commented on this post, but she posted that, we have a housing shortage. She said, why is it that your grandparents, right, were able to buy houses so cheap, yet you can't even afford an apartment? And her reason was, well, there's a housing shortage, and so we need the government. We need the government to solve this housing problem, to make housing affordable again. When the real reason that housing is unaffordable now is because of the government. The reason it was less affordable for your grandparents was because there was less government involvement. It's the government that has driven up the cost of housing. And if there's a housing shortage, it's because of government policy that has created it. Government doesn't create anything. The government doesn't create abundance. The government creates scarcity. So if there's a scarcity of houses, it's because the government has done something to prevent the free market from solving that problem. Because in the free market, people want to get rich. So if there's not enough housing, what's going to happen in the free market? Houses are going to get built, right? Entrepreneurs are going to see this untapped need. They're going to see, oh, there's a lot of people who don't have housing. Oh, let me build some houses. I'll get rich because I have this huge market of people who need housing. If that's not happening, it's because of rules and regulation and taxes that are preventing the free market from doing what the free market does best. And of course, why housing is also unaffordable is why everything else is unaffordable, because the government is destroying the value of our money, because the government is running these huge deficits and they're printing all this money. But who is supporting all this government spending? Well, it's Elizabeth Warren. And of course, if we had more government housing programs, we would take the current housing crisis and make it worse. Look, everything the government gets involved in gets more expensive. Look at education. Look at healthcare, right? Education, healthcare, housing. Those are the three things where the government is most involved. And that's where you have costs going up. Where is the government not involved, right? Well, they're not involved in technology. They're not involved in cell phones. Why do you think so many people have cell phones? All these people that don't have houses have an iPhone or something like that. If the government was involved in cell phones the way they are in education, healthcare, and housing, then a lot of people wouldn't have those. And Elizabeth Warren, we talk about the shortage of cell phones and all the people who don't have cell phones and say, well, the government needs to create them cell phones. Well, the government wouldn't have any more success at, alleviating that shortage than they will at housing or whatever, anything else. The government is causing these problems. Elizabeth Warren has no idea. I mean, she's one of the big advocates of eliminating student loans. Well, why do students have all these loans? Because of her, because of the government. Before the government got involved in college education, it was cheap. Nobody had to borrow money to go to college before the government started guaranteeing these loans. Some people worked their way through college if their parents didn't have any money, so they had a job on the weekends or a job during the summer, but they made plenty of money from those jobs to pay all their bills and graduate college debt-free. It was not a big deal. You didn't have to save for college before the government made it so expensive, right? And now it's so expensive you can't even save for college. The only way most people can pay for college is by going into debt, thanks to the government. Then the government gets to complain about all the debt that the students have. And, the only reason that all these subsidies existed was that's how the government bought the votes of the 18-year-olds the minute they got the right to vote. That's when all this started in the 1960s. Why did the government really start subsidizing college? Because we lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, right? But at 21, people are graduating college, right? So it wasn't as important. But at 18, you're about to start. And so how did the government get the 18-year-olds to vote for them? By promising that they didn't have to work over the summer. Hey, you know what? You could take the summer off. You could go to Europe. You can hang out on the beach. We got you covered with a government loan, right? Why work your way through college when you could borrow money with a government guarantee, right? Because the banks wouldn't loan the money without the government guarantee. They're not fools. But once the government co-signed the loans, yeah, you could get a low interest loan. So, take the summer off. And it started from there because now the colleges were like, this is great. Let's really raise our prices. Let's build these expensive gymnasiums and build it into the tuition because no one gives a damn because the government's paying the bills. And so they took all the free market incentives out of it, and then college costs went way up. And at the same time, the price of a college degree went up. The value of the college degree went down because of government subsidies. A lot of people who shouldn't have gone to college ended up going. So we had a lot more people with college degrees than we would have had without the government. And so the value of that degree went down while the costs went through the roof. See, that's the opposite of what the free market does. The free market brings quality up and price down. The government brings quality down and price up. So now, they used to say a long time ago, you got to go to college. Otherwise, you're going to end up, serving French fries at McDonald's, right? Now they say you got to go get a college degree so you can get a job at McDonald's serving French fries, right? This is what the government has done to a college degree. They did the same thing to housing, and Elizabeth Warren just doesn't understand that. Anyway, that's it for today. Remember, if you like the video or the YouTube or the podcast, whatever, make sure and comment on it. Give it a thumbs up. Hey, also, if you haven't subscribed yet to our newsletter, our Schiff the premium at Schiff Sovereign Premium, hopefully everybody is getting the free newsletter over at Schiff Sovereign. But if you're not getting the premium letter, make sure and go over to Schiff Sovereign and sign up. Bye for now.